Mark 1. Conversations at the speed of sound.
The Royal Australian Air Force Base at Amberley in South Queensland is a bomber base, and the majority of the aircraft there are Canberras. The Operational Conversion Unit at Amberley trains officers to fly these jet bombers. Pilots and navigators with considerable flying time in other service aircraft come from all over Australia to take the conversion course here. After the conversion course has proceeded for about 6 weeks, the crews start to fly on bombing runs in squadron aircraft. First, they use small practice bombs, and then the 1,000-pounders, of which the Canberra carries 6.
Hello and welcome to Mach 1, the podcast of the Queensland Air Museum Caloundra, and to this, the first of a two-part episode featuring the Canberra bomber, a very well-preserved example of which, number 225, is currently on display undercover in Hangar 2 at the Queensland Air Museum. My name is Gary Hills. I am a QAM volunteer, and I'll be your host for these episodes. Now, you just heard an excerpt from a 1968 Air Force educational video held at the National Film and Sound Archives and available to watch in its entirety on the Queensland Air Museum website, along with other videos and many photographs as well, and a detailed provenance of the QAM's Canberra, as I say, number 225, prepared by QAM founding member and historian Ron Cuskelly. You can find all of that on the website under Collections. Now, in these two episodes, this one and one next week, you'll hear my conversations with two ex-RAAF personnel about the Canberra. Firstly, from Air Commodore retired Peter Growder, who served for 33 years in the Air Force as a navigator and later in command at Amberley Air Base, and then from Warrant Officer retired Steele Rudd, who was an engine fitter for many years in the Air Force, working on and instructing other engine fitters on the engines of the Sabres, the Mirages, Canberras, and the F-111s. Now, you're going to hear in this episode roughly 10 minutes from each of these gentlemen, and then again next week you're going to hear roughly the same from each of them again as they finish the story that you'll hear the first part of today. And as you can imagine, it's fascinating to hear the recollections of both aircrew and ground crew, and that's why I asked them both if they would be willing to talk. I asked Peter to give us a bit of a potted introduction to the Canberra, and then I asked both of them to reflect on their experiences serving in particular in Vietnam with number 2 Squadron during the war. Peter was there in 1969 and Steele was there in 1968. Now, even though the story of the Canberra is a much larger one than just the Vietnam experience, I thought we'd focus in on that for these couple of episodes anyway, and we'll return to the Canberra perhaps at a later stage to talk about some of the other aspects of its service. So, firstly, my conversation with Peter Growder, and that will be followed immediately by 10 minutes or so of my conversation with Steele Rudd. Well, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio today by RAAF Air Commodore retired and QAM volunteer Peter Growder. G'day, Peter.
G'day, Gary.
I have been looking forward to this. It's good of you to join me. We're going to talk particularly, I think, in this little segment now about your experience of the Canberra bomber. There are many other things I'd like to talk to you about, so we will come back to your career in aviation at another time because that's a fascinating story too. But just for now, we're focusing in on the Canberras, and I know you have a very personal experience with them, so that's the recollections we're looking for. So why don't you start out by telling us where you're from and what is your background in aviation?
Oh, thank you for giving me the opportunity, Gary. I'm from Brisbane and on the south side of Brisbane. Probably I got my first exposure to aviation, I think, in the Air Training Corps, as it was, at 15 Flight at Cavendish Road. That whetted my appetite, I think. And after leaving school, I worked in a bank for a couple of years. They were posing country service to me at that stage. And I also saw the ads for pilots in the Air Force, which I applied for.
And what year are we talking?
1966.
Okay.
And applied and then went through the process. I was unsuccessful in applying as a pilot, and they offered me navigator, which I accepted. So from January 1967, I started my navigator training on the Dakota.
Okay, the Dakota. And how long was your career then to follow?
For another 33 years, Gary. And, I probably had the joy and the experiences of going through flying operations, as I'll call it, in Vietnam, in Australia, in administration projects. I did an exchange tour with the American Air Force, a course in Canada where I learnt what cold really means, and then command. And I finished up at Amberley in command on the F-111, so I could not have asked for a better career.
Fantastic, yeah. Well, and how many hours in the air?
All up, it differed for different aircraft, but probably I was about 800 hours on the Canberra and about 1,800 in the F-111 and about 500 then on the Phantom in between.
Okay. Let's talk more about the Canberras in a second. You, as a QAM volunteer, what do you do at the Queensland Air Museum?
I'm one of the volunteer guides here, and we get associated with tour groups, school groups, and find that, in fact, probably the school ones are quite a challenge actually at times because they are very inquisitive and very knowledgeable. Some of them that come. Also a colleague and I, who you've interviewed previously, were running the F-111 Ultimate Experience.
Now, you're being very humble because I know there's a lot of other things you do also for the QAM. We don't need to go into all of them, but just to say thank you for, the incredible expertise and commitment you bring to the place from your long career in aviation and in administration, leadership, in command. You're bringing talents and skills as a volunteer, which are vital to an organisation like this, so thank you. Let's talk about Canberras, the Canberra bomber. Now, we have an example of the GAF Canberra here, number 225, which was the first aircraft purchased by the organisation that set up the museum, and it's very well presented in Hangar 2 undercover, and it's open to visitors when there is a guide to show them through, and I know you do that too. What was this aircraft designed to do initially when it was first conceived, and how good was it at what it did?
Well, we stepped back a little bit. It was really conceived as a replacement for the Mosquito, and the designer, I think he was trying to match what I call an air staff requirement, which is a military term for the Air Force must have stipulated their requirements, and that they wanted a high-speed, high-altitude, unarmed light bomber with a crew of 2.
Okay.
Then went into cruising speeds and altitudes, and a bomb load. They stipulated something like 7,500 pounds, and the initial one was to be delivered by non-visual means.
What's that mean?
I think by radar, but technology hadn't quite caught up with it. And so when they hadn't got to that point and the design was progressing, they had to redesign the nose area a bit so that the bomb aimer, navigator, that's where you find it's got the glass or the perspex nose on it. And it's a bit World War II-ish era, I think. You're lying down the front with your sight, and you insert an angle that's a reflection of altitude, speed, and you apply the drift that's caused by the wind. And that equates to the delivery profile for the particular weapon that you're carrying.
Okay. And you would calculate that all on the spot manually, virtually?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
You had readouts of your speeds and your drift, so you could use that to apply that angle. And to get, and I'm probably stepping ahead a bit, but to get the bomb onto the target, the pilot would line up, but at a point in time, because of the long nose, they would start to lose sight of the target, and that's when I'll call it the navigator, would then give oral directions of left and right and steady. And most of the pilots could tell by the inflection and the high-pitched tone in your voice that we were getting closer to the target.
You're right, it does sound very World War II-ish, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And as you say, a replacement for the Mosquito. So we're talking the very early stages of the jet age, aren't we?
Yes, yeah.
And so how good was it? I mean, obviously it was picked up, and so it must have been good at what it was aiming to do.
Yeah, well, I think the design itself, it's probably one of the first ones I've seen where a government was willing to authorise the production of the aircraft before it really had got to maturity in its design process.
Wow.
And I think, we're talking back in the 1950s. It was probably how good it was. It ended up holding a number of records. I think, about 15 official records. And it was the first British jet to fly over the North Pole. It held a number of records, I think, between the UK and the US for a while. And
speed and altitude records.
Yeah, it's quite a neat and a smooth-looking aircraft when you look at it. It was so successful that, the Americans took it on, and their first ones were very similar, they built, to the ones that, like 225 here, the domed sort of cockpit, and the navigator sitting in the back flying to the front. But then they modified the design to, as they called it, the B-57, to a tandem cockpit configuration. And they put stronger wings and hard points under the wings. They had rockets under there. And they also put in a rotary bomb delivery mechanism in the bomb bay. So they'd carry, I think, 4 or 6 bombs, and this would rotate around. So they were more into the dive bombing with theirs.
Whereas
ours, we would use in a level bombing mode. And if I probably using Vietnam as an example, it was the only real aircraft bomber probably in Vietnam, low-level bomber anyway, that would do level bombing. Most of the other fighters would be doing dive bombing. And in the tropics, you can get caught out with cloud and weather conditions, whereas we could come in under the cloud. And we would quite often be the one bombing when others had to give it away because the weather didn't allow them to fly the profile that they wanted to fly.
So yeah, obviously, as you say, very clean lines. It's quite a neat looking aircraft, and powered by 2 jet engines. Now we used the Avons, is that right? The Avon engines.
That's correct.
Yeah, the Rolls Royce. Yeah. Why was it named Canberra? That's an interesting. Was it named after the city of Canberra?
There is speculation it was, in an attempt to convince Australia to buy it. When you look at the number that we purchased, we ended up with about 50 odd aircraft.
Okay.
We got 2 from the Brits first, as what they call pattern aircraft, and then built 48 down at the Government Aircraft Factory.
Yep.
And then I think we might have also got another couple of trainers after that.
Yeah. Now, when Australia bought the Canberras and decided that they were for us, was there anything particular about the role that they were requiring, or was it the same as the English Electric Canberra?
I think it was very much the same. Again, this high altitude unarmed bomber. I mean, it had quite decent range, and for Australia's environment, range becomes an important issue. And I think that the fact that you could go to different places, and if the weather wasn't great, you could come back or you could hold for a while.
Now, our Canberras operated Butterworth, Malaya. You've mentioned Vietnam.
Yeah.
Where were they based in Australia?
At Amberley was the main.
In Brisbane.
Yes, yep.
Or west of Brisbane.
West of Brisbane.
Now, you've mentioned to me they had a number of roles too throughout their service, didn't they? Including cartography, I think.
Yes. Probably that really came into its own probably after they came back from Vietnam in the early 70s. And again, because it was a good high altitude flyer, very stable, good endurance, they fitted some large, and you could fit large cameras in them. That allowed them to fly particularly through Northern Australia and Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. And that probably, in those days, you had to have the photography, and the weather conditions in the tropical environment can be problematic, but the Canberra could sort of, zig its way around a bit, or they could wait. And sometimes the weather has a habit of moving on. But I think probably nowadays that's probably been replaced by satellites
sure.
imagery. But certainly it was very, very good photography, and we helped probably our northern neighbours complete their mapping in areas that they probably couldn't get the mapping done previously, and that was part of I believe the Defence Cooperation Program that we were running at the time.
Okay, and one imagines that a bomber without bombs, therefore lighter, its performance is going to be even that much better, isn't it, in terms of endurance and so on?
Yes, yeah. It meant, in Vietnam we were carrying 4 bombs in the bomb bay and 1 on each wingtip.
Right. For a total of how many thousand pounds? Is that?
The bombs themselves could either be 500 pounds as they started with. Most of the ones that I was involved with were 750 pounds, and I'm sorry I'm talking pounds. But we also had some 1,000 pounders. Might have been World War II surplus stock or something. We had a few of those we got rid of. But out on the wingtips, if you weren't carrying bombs, you could have fuel tanks out there. And 225 here has the fuel tanks on them. And so that gave you very good endurance.
Okay, well, let's talk about Vietnam. So you've already mentioned a few things about the level bombing and low-level bombing in particular. You've mentioned their endurance and how well they performed. Your role there was for a tour, 12 months, was it?
Yeah, I did 11 months.
11 months?
Yep.
In what year was that?
1969, 70. And
was that based at Phan Rang?
Yeah. The squadron deployed from Butterworth across to Phan Rang, and that was, I think, started in 1967, April 1967. They were initially involved in what we call combat sky spot, which is radar-guided bombing deliveries, mostly at night. And so the radar would direct you on a heading, so fairly accurate flying was required, and then they would tell you when to release the bomb. And so that gave you basically an all-weather and all-area capability. I think it was one of the commanding officers there reinforced his belief that the Canberra could be good on visual bombing, and they progressively wore down those who were in control, and we ended up going from the combat Sky Scott solely and we were doing basically 8 sorties a day. 7 of them were visual, and 1 was a combat Sky Spot every night.
So you mentioned 8 sorties a day. Let's think about a typical day then for a Canberra operating in Vietnam. What kinds of things would happen?
You normally started with a wake-up call by the duty driver. One of the operations clerks would come and rouse you, and that was normally about 1 hour before you expected to take off. And so you had to fit in your get up, and then they would come back and pick you up, and you get the full brief. And the operations clerk, who had been on duty most of the night, if not all night, would then be the one who gave you the brief on where you're going, who you would be contacting, the forward air controller there, and what frequency, and what the weather conditions were supposed to be.
And did the navigator and the pilot receive the same briefing, or did you have separate briefings?
No, same briefings. Well, again, it comes back to the crew concept. You just did everything together.
Yep. Okay.
And even to the extent that quite often you shared the same room with your pilot.
Right.
And in my case, I lucked out. I had a wonderful guy. I was very lucky.
That's good. That's a big part of morale and your own sense of well-being, isn't it? So, okay, you'd get your briefing and then out to the flight line, you up into the air?
Yeah, you go through the maintenance control. They tell you which aircraft. You'd look at its servicing history, any unserviceabilities it may have had.
This is before every single flight?
Yes.
And that could be 8 a day?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it may have just returned and you're taking over and you're doing the full check again?
Yeah, they probably had enough aircraft to rotate through, but if there had been some, they had to catch up with something, yes, some of the aircraft would be turned quite quickly.
Okay.
We had some very dedicated ground crew there, and I suppose it's the environment you're living in at the time that you were just there for operations, and so if work was required, work was what you did. Yeah. And the flying, you may go do a mission and come back, and a test flight was required sometimes. So you'd do what you had to do post the mission, and then go and do the test flight, because that meant another aircraft could be placed in the readiness and get online.
Helicopters, helicopters, helicopters. January the 21st, 2023 is the Queensland Air Museum Helicopters Open Day. Don't miss it. Between 10 and 4 that day, it's going to be all helicopters. We'll have all of our military and civilian helicopters open with guides who have flown in or worked on these aircraft and have great stories to tell. We'll run engines, we'll have helicopter simulators and other activities for the kids. You'll be able to book a joy flight over Caloundra in one of the Ocean View Robinson helicopters, and so much more. Mark your diary now, January the 21st, 2023, for the QAM Helicopters Open Day. See you there.
But settled into 2 Squadron very quickly. Of course, all the aircraft were in solid revetments, blast-proof pens, because things happened. We had a few mortar attacks and a few rocket attacks onto the base. And I remember about 4 revetments up from us, they scored on a couple of F-100s, in revetments. People were killed and aircraft destroyed. But settled into 2 Squadron very, very quickly. Our CO was Air Commodore, Wing Commander Evans, a stickler for discipline and serviceability. He was to rise to Chief of the Royal Australian Air Force in due course as a Air Marshal. But we settled in very, very quickly. And I brag about this. The serviceability rate, as I remember, all the time in 2 Squadron was something like 98 or 90%. It was extreme. If an aircraft came back unserviceable, it was worked on until it was made serviceable. We just did not lose sorties. We would hold a spare, and most of our bombing was night interdiction. There were daylight raids, of course, for the Army, when our Army called for stuff. But a lot of our bombing was night interdiction, radar plotted bombing.
You were working exclusively on Canberras?
Exclusively on Canberras. And it was a good tour, but the shifts were long and demanding. We would start on a Monday morning, we'll say, and we worked days. Then we might work for the week, we'd have a day off, and then we would start night shift, and you'd do 4 nights, during which time you'd go down about 8 o'clock at night, and you'd work through the night, because that's when the majority of our sorties were carried out, during the night. But as I said, there would be day sorties called for occasionally. So
during the day when you were off duty, were you able to rest? It must have been noisy.
The only way, after a short period, most of us got to the stage where I asked Bev to send me up one of those things you put over your eyes, and most of us bought little radio that you plugged into your ear with earmuffs to blot out the aircraft noise and artillery, because just not far from us was a big 155mm artillery unit. And when they were firing, believe you not, but the air movements of Butterworth, I beg your pardon, at Fanrang were constant, day and night. So sleeping during the day was near impossible.
And then you'd work all night.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. So by the end of 4 days or 4 nights working, the day you had off, you were absolutely beat. And after that, you got back into days again.
So from the point of view of efficiency, you know, the work you're doing, and you're exhausted and you're distracted, and did the work suffer at all? You say that
never.
Okay. Yep.
Never. As a matter of fact, we worked as a team, and I'll just give you an example. Dave Pryday was the airframes, I was engines, and on the night shift, we were the 2 sergeants on the night shift, and there would be one of each of the other musterings on as well. You know, electronics, the whole works. And what we would do, we'd see an aircraft off, and when the aircraft left, I would say, or David would say to half of the crew, you get to sleeping on concrete, and it's surprising how well you sleep on concrete and just put your head on your flak jacket. And you could, 20 minutes, you could have 20 minutes.
Have a nap, yep.
Have a nap. And we would alternate through the night, where possible, to get the lads down, to just give them a bit of a break. But what helped us was we were very fortunate that the messing situation at Fanrang was beyond belief. It was so good. They didn't have cooks, they had chefs. They had bakers and pastry cook, would you believe? So come midnight, a giant flask would arrive with coffee and one with tea, with goodies and cookies. There would be a meal available in the mess where we could send some of the lads up for a proper meal at midnight to 1 o'clock. And then about 4 o'clock in the morning, the coffee and cakes or whatever would come again. Wow. That's where we were particularly well taken care of. During my time at 2 Squadron, we did not lose an aircraft, which was a blessing. That came later. But I think, an interesting point, and it's worth talking about. We had a Canberra and the pilots were saying, this aircraft's a dog. It doesn't want to lift at the appropriate time. Bearing in mind the aircraft, for most of the time I was there, was carrying 4 1,000-pound bombs in the bomb bay and a 500 out on each wingtip.
Instead of a fuel tank.
Yep. So because the distances were short, so we could carry the load.
Now, these were the American bombs, is that right?
No,
they're different.
We were using up World War II bombs, would you believe? Until, I'd say, halfway through my tour, we ran out 1,000-pounders and 500. So we went to the American 750-pound bombs. So once again, 4 750s in the bomb bay.
And 2 on the wings.
Yeah, 2 on the wings.
Right.
But this aircraft wouldn't lift. Anyway, a couple of pilots flew it and said it's a dog. And when you get to the end of near the end of the runway and you've got that bomb load on, running off the end of the strip isn't an option. So all of a sudden they said, you sumpies, you engine people have got 2 engines that are not performing. And we took them out, we checked them. Anyway, this continued until they said, oh, look, where are we going to go with this? And Dave Priday, who has been around Canberras for many years, the airframe fitters start to look at the tailplanes and work. And with the Canberra, the whole tailplane moves. The whole tailplane, the horizontal stabiliser moves, actuated, but also there's a trim tab on the end of that. And the deeper they looked, they found out that the bushes in this Canberra on the tailplane were worn. The tailplane at a certain speed was floating and the angle was allowed to change, which was holding the nose down and holding it late in liftoff. Well, what do we do now? So, of course, a Hercules brought in a full brand new tailplane assembly from either Butterworth or Australia. And that was fitted without us losing a sortie. It was incredible. And, of course, that overcame that problem.
And, of course, it wasn't your engines.
Oh, no, but of course, the 2 engines, they insisted in the end that we change engines. Yeah. And much to my displeasure, they said, we've got to change the engines. You've got to. So, all right, we changed the engines. A Herc came and picked them up. Due course, they finished at CAC in Melbourne, and a letter came back. What was wrong with these engines, fellas?
Nothing's wrong.
They're performing to everything. So, of course, we knew that.
So that's our episode. I found that fascinating. I hope you did too. Part 2 next week, and Peter and Steele will both be back for that episode to pick up their stories where they left off. Please join us. Now, I might add that an earlier episode of the podcast, back in Season 1, I interviewed Ron Cuskelly about the beginnings of the Queensland Air Museum and the story of the Canberra No. 225, the very first aircraft acquired by the small, intrepid band who were getting the museum started. It's a great story. Have a look for the episode entitled The Bomber with Nowhere to Go, if you want to hear a little bit about that. So join me again next week, and in the meantime, remember that the Queensland Air Museum is open every day from 10 till 4, except Christmas Day and Easter Friday, and we would love to meet you. Come in and see us soon. Bye for now.